So now that we have Terraform installed in our Linux environment, why don't we go ahead and create a Terraform file from scratch? First of all, Terraform files are just simply text files. You can create them in any text editor you want, and I prefer to use Windows as I'm pretty fast with my mouse copying and pasting back and forth between web browsers and the online documentation. But if you want to use Linux, that's fine too. The files that Terraform uses to create your environment are divided into two files, main.tf and variables.tf. Main.tf is the file that's going to contain 90% of your Terraform code, and that's going to be, how to, and that's going to be creating, your VPC and your VSIs and your subnets and your gateways, etc., etc. Your variables.tf is going to contain just a handful of lines that are going to hold some global variables that you will reference later on in your main.tf. So in the variables.tf file, you'll have some items like the IBM Cloud API key, which is how you log into, which is how Terraform logs in to the IBM Cloud account. Then you're also going to have some items like the definitions of your VSIs, like the compute, the RAM, the CPU, the network, etc. And you're going to have some other information there too. But the variables are going to be pretty short. Now what's nice is by separating them out into these two different files, you can pass your main.tf to other peers in your organization, and all they need to do is either create the variables.tf file by themselves, or they can take your variables file and just change the items in there. So we'll take a look at that in a minute. First, as we get into our main.tf file, we can use comments, and that's designated by the pound symbol. I like to over-comment my files because it's great for anyone to go ahead and read what the file is going to do. So in here, we start off with a couple of comments. I'm stating that this main.tf file will create a VPC, 2 subnets, 3 security groups and some rules, 2 VSIs, and a gateway. This TF file is also going to create an environment in VPC that's identical to a video we created earlier with a product tour. Also, this file, I'm stating that it works with Terraform version 0.11.14 and the IBM Cloud Provider 0.17.3. And then I'm also putting in 2 links to the online documentation so that if I ever want to reference back to where did I get this information from and how did I write these files, there they are. So let's go ahead and pull up that documentation so we can see it side by side on how we're doing it here. Here's my IBM Cloud Provider documentation. And we have it organized on the left-hand side via the different areas such as the Cloud Foundry data, container data sources, infrastructure data sources. But what we are going to use today are the VPC data sources, and then further on, more VPC pieces, which is down near the bottom. And that's the VPC service resources. Let's get started. So in this first segment of code, I want to define my IBM Cloud account information. And I'm using this particular reference of how to do it. And that's exactly where the documentation starts, which is the very first step. You need to have your API key so Terraform knows how to log in to the IBM account. I'm then doing provider IBM, just like they are, provider, and then IBM. So that's compared to Amazon or Microsoft or whoever. And then we're using the IBM Cloud underscore API key equals something, and that's what they're doing here. And in my case, I'm setting it to a variable rather than explicitly putting it right in here. So I'm setting it to a variable that IBM Cloud underscore API key. Now let's go take a look at our variables file and see where that is. Again, my variables file, I put comments in here to keep it easy to read. And at the very beginning on line 5, I state, here's my definition of my IBM Cloud account. It's going to be called IBM Cloud underscore API key. And I'm giving it my key itself in here. Now, in a previous video, we showed you how to create that key, but I'll show it to you again here. If you go back to your browser and into your account, if you choose Manage and then access, and then IBM Cloud API keys, here are your API keys. And if you need to create one, you click the button here, just give it a test. It creates the key for you. You can look at it, and there is the key for later today. Now this time is going to be the only time you'll see the key. So you'll want to copy it to your clipboard, download it, put it in Notepad, whatever, because once it's created, that's it. You won't be able to go back. However, if you need to create one again, you can just go ahead and do that. And you can certainly delete them. So I'm going to delete this. So back to our variables file, we see that we have our key in there. Now we go back to main. So we've defined the IBM Cloud _ API key. Now we need to do generation 1, which tells it which generation of VPC to use. In October 2019, IBM came out with Gen 2 of their VPC architecture. I'm going to use Gen 1 because that's what I've been using for a while, and that's where a lot of my sample code is. So we're going to keep it at 1. And then the region is US-South. Now in this case, you're probably wondering, how did I get to US-South? Well, if we go down to our Linux environment where we have Terraform installed, we can use the command IBM Cloud space regions, and it will tell me all the regions that are here. So I can use one called US-South. Going back to our main.tf file, I now say, okay, I want to create a VPC. I've given you my account information. Now I actually want you to start creating things in my account. So I'm going to say I want it to create a VPC. And again, I'm putting online documentation references in my code. And we'll just go ahead and put it in here so we can follow along. And you'll see here that they're using the term resource space IBM is VPC. They're doing test ACC and then name. So what they're doing is they're using the resource IBM is VPC. They're giving it an ID, like what is this resource ID, and then the name. In my case, I'm saying IBM is VPC. I'm going to call it VPC1 as my identifier. And then the name inside my VPC will be called VPC DTE. Going further on down, as I create my VPC, I want to create some subnets. So I'm going to create a default subnet here. And again, link to the online documentation. And we're saying resource, again, space IBM is subnet. So that's the command. And then I'm doing subnet 1, which is my identifier. And then I'm defining what subnet 1 is. So subnet 1 is going to be called VPC-pubpriv-backend-subnet in my VPC architecture. And then it's asking for what VPC do I want to create the subnet in. Well, I want to create it in the subnet we just created in the VPC we just created a minute ago. So we use the IBM _ is VPC reference dot VPC1 in my case dot ID. Now the zone. What zone do I want to reference in? Well, in here, this is where I'm using my variable var zone 1. So if I go back to my variables, I'm defining zone 1 and I'm defining it as US-South-1. Coming back, I'm now giving it an IP block 10.240.0.0.24. I'm now creating a second subnet for some VSIs. And we already went to that subnet documentation, so we're already there. It's doing just another one. So again, we're calling it, this one's going to be, the identifier is going to be called Bastion subnet. I'm going to give it a name of VPC-secure-bastion-subnet, which will be listed as the friendly name. What VPC do I want to go to? Well, the ID. So if I double click here, I see that I'm referenced up there. Zone, again, zone 1 in my variables file. What IP range? There it is. And then here I'm referencing that I want to use a public gateway. So where's our public gateway? Here's our public gateway down below. Now before we go further, Terraform looks at the entire main.tf file and figures out what dependencies are needed. So you don't need to write your code in the order that items will be necessary to create. So when Terraform runs through this, it knows that it needs to go create a public gateway to use earlier on in the code. So let's look at the online documentation for how to create a public gateway. And here we are. So we're using the resource term again. Okay, you'll notice that we're using a lot of resource terms. IBM is public_gateway. We're going to give it an identifier, DTE_gateway. We're going to give it a name, and I'm going to call it DTE_gateway also. And then I'm telling it what VPC I want to create this gateway in. Well, it's VPC1. And then what zone? I'm doing zone 1 again. So let's spend a little more time in the variables.tf file. We've already talked about the API key. We've shown about zone 1, about how to use that. We're also defining here my SSH public key when I create VSIs. And that's located in the directory .ssh underscore of my Linux environment. So I'm defining that here, so I don't have to define it anywhere else again. Then I'm going to tell it two items: which VSI template and how much RAM and CPU power to give to it. So in here, we're using a variable called image. And then we're defining what the image is. And then we're also creating a variable called profile, and we're defining it here. So let's take a look at how I got that information. We already saw the US South one, but we can do IBM Cloud is images, which will give us a list of all of our commands. Now you'll see the CentOS one is right here, the C11. And then the command is instances profile, IBM Cloud is instance profile, gives us a listing of the profiles we use once we create that. So you see, so the documentation is pretty easy.